theology. We chop it up properly without an apology. Gotta give doxology to God hollow, because this is how we do it at All Things Theology. All Things Theology, All Things Theology. We chop it up properly without an apology. Gotta give doxology to God hollow, because this is how we do it at All Things Theology.
We are live. Yo, grace and peace, guys. This is Kdub, and welcome to another edition of All Things Theology. I'm excited for today's episode because it's not normal that you have live interaction where people of opposing viewpoints, and maturity come together and discuss their disagreements. And so I'm very excited for that to happen today. And with me is Mr. Will Gray. What's going on, man?
Hey, what's up?
Yeah, man. So introduce yourself, man. Tell the people who you are and things like that.
All right, yeah. So, my name's Will, and I'm from Stockton, California, Missionary Baptist Church. I'm kind of a trailblazer as far as churches. Went from Missionary Baptist Church to Black Pentecostal Church to white evangelicalism to white Reformed. Now I'm currently in the PCA in Sacramento, California. So yeah, that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Cool, man.
Love to read. I'm no theologian, but I love to read. Right. So that's my.
Well, as R.C. Sproul said, man, everybody's a theologian.
Yeah, I heard.
Yeah. So we became Facebook friends sometime a while back, and ever since then, I guess we've kind of engaged in this topic of, let's just get it out there, right? Our thesis for tonight: should Christians use critical race theory as an analytical tool? So you've kind of pushed back on a lot of a lot of things I've said publicly, and that's fine. I don't have any problem with that. I'm not the standard, and so when I say you push back, I don't mean to say anything negative about you, but just that we've had disagreement, right? And so I don't know if you want to just express kind of the disagreement you have, or let me lay it out there and we kind of just get into this discussion. What's good for you, man? You're my guest. I'll let you decide.
Oh, okay. Well, that's generous. Yeah. I think I'll let you start.
Okay.
See kind of the flow of how you want to do this. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah. All right. So I have no problem with that. So I'm just trying to share all this stuff out. So my main disagreement is, and it seems like at some point I think you've kind of agreed with my initial assertion that critical race theory is a unbiblical ideology. It sounds like I guess I'll start there. Would you agree that critical race theory is an unbiblical ideology? Like it's not compatible with Scripture, like the ideology itself.
Yeah, well, yeah, it has secular beginnings, right? It's not a Christian movement by any means.
Okay. Yeah. And so I would see that as, because you state that it's secular, and not just secular movement, because secular people they can be right about things. So I guess my confrontation with critical race theory isn't that, well, these are just secular people. Well, my argument is actually much more fundamental than that. It's actually that this ideology stems from a secular worldview. Marcus Webb, what's going on? He's asking, what's the topic? The topic is critical race theory. Should Christians use critical race theory as an analytical tool? And so I'm actually saying something more fundamentally than, hey, some secular people said something, we shouldn't listen to that, because of common grace, I believe a lot of times secular people get things right, so I'm actually saying that the worldview of critical race theory actually stems from a secular worldview itself, and so this is why I say, hey, it cannot be compatible with the Scriptures. And just because they get things right, we don't splice up the ideology and say, hey, they get this right, because a lot of unbiblical worldviews get things right, on some issues, but I don't see a lot of Christians arguing for using half-truths of Arianism. I know I brought that up to you, and you didn't like that analogy, but I think it was fitting, because Arianism actually gets the humanity of Jesus right, that he is fully man, you know. Um, but I think it would be absurd to say, hey, let's use Arianism as a critical, as an analytical tool just for the humanity of Jesus. I think that would be absurd. And so I don't know if you have any pushback on that, but I'll definitely allow you to say what you have to say and voice your concerns about my position for sure.
Yeah, yeah. All right, yeah. So I think one of the first questions someone might ask is, what is critical race theory? So I actually have a quote from Richard Delgado.
Yeah.
Critical race theory. It's an introduction. So on page 3, he says,
From what book,
critical
by
race
the way?
theory.
Yeah, I just
It's
want people to know,
called,
just in case they're interested.
yeah, critical race theory and
Okay,
introduction.
cool.
3rd edition. So he says, the critical race theory movement is a collection of activists and scholars engaged in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. The movement considers many of the same issues that conventional civil rights and ethnic studies discourses take up, but places them in a broader perspective that includes economics, history, setting, group, and self-interest, and emotions and, and the unconscious. Unlike traditional civil rights discourse, which stresses incrementalism and step-by-step progress, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, enlightenment, rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law.
Yeah.
So I know that's a mouthful, but that just shows how this collection of activists and scholars, how there's not really this core base of beliefs in critical race theory. Now they do have
I would agree with that.
various, yeah, they do have various proponents that they all espouse, and I'll get into a little bit of that later. But really, what I think the issue is, isn't so much the church talk about critical race theory as much as it is should the church talk about race. And the reason why I say that is because I remember, with the George Floyd killing, right? And I remember being in a white Reformed church, and there was no prayers mentioned about it. There was no prayers for the family. And then the riots started happening, and we made sure, let's pray about the riots. But there was no mention about Ahmaud Arbery, about Breonna Taylor. So for me, I think the church is kind of using a scapegoat, right? We don't want to talk about critical race theory when we really don't want to talk about race. So that means critical race theory, racial reconciliation, wokeness, whatever the terminology we want to use. And there's a lot of intersection there, right? We don't want to talk about race.
Who's we?
White evangelicals. All of those that are anti-woke, anti-social justice, those are the ones who we don't want to talk about race. Race is divisive. To talk about race is...
What if it's we don't want to talk about race from a critical race theory framework? That's because that's what I see more so. I don't think many Christians have a problem with talking about race, or I don't even like that term ethnicity, because race is a social construct. But I, from my perspective, it's that people do not want to, white Christians, if you want to use that terminology, do not want to adopt a framework, do not want to talk about race already from a secular advantage point, already from you start with a secular ideology, and then you weave it back into the scriptures. A lot of times is what I see. And so I think that's more so maybe what you're seeing, if we can analyze, white people, so to speak. But so yeah, and I would take that same
white people.
And I would take that same framework as the people maybe you're talking about, that I have no issue talking about ethnicity as long as we're using a biblical framework and not starting with a secular philosophy or ideology when we talk about ethnicity. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so maybe we can get into this point because we talked about what critical race theory is
Yeah.
very briefly. We can definitely
Yeah.
talk about it longer, um, because it seems there's so it seems like you're saying, hey, look, I don't affirm critical race theory as a whole, and if I'm misrepresenting you, please let me know. I do not want to do that, and so I think it's very important in discussions like this. Um, it seems like what you're saying is, hey, I don't affirm critical race theory as a whole. It shouldn't. It seems like what you've said, in past discussion is no Christian should affirm it as a whole, but there are concepts of critical race theory that we can learn from, and actually that are beneficial for the Christian worldview. Am I representing you rightly?
Yeah. No.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. Yeah.
Anything you like to
And
say?
it's
Okay,
interesting.
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, because if you look at the beginnings of critical race theory, it really began from civil rights retrenchment,
Mm-hmm.
right? So here it is, 20 years later. Um, let me see. Let me pull it up. After you have things like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right? You have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Here we are 20 years later, and the disparities are only growing, right? And I have a bunch of statistics here where they say continuing disparities exist between African Americans and white in virtually every measurable category. In 1986, so about 20 years later, right, the African American poverty rate stood at 31%, compared with 11% for whites. Black median income was 57% that of whites, a decline of about 4 percentile points since the 1970s. Between 1981 and 85, black unemployment averaged 17%, compared to 7.3% for whites. In 1968, approximately 44% of all black children lived in poverty. Like, that's huge, 44%.
So let me ask you
Blacks,
this about those disparities. Why do you so
yeah.
it seems like your conclusion is that those disparities exist because of racism, of white racism. Is that your analysis of those disparities?
Well, I haven't got that far
Okay,
yet.
okay. But it
I'm just
is that
showing
your
that.
is that your conclusion though? And those would be like
That's
evidences of that would be evidence of these disparities.
it's an evidence of injustice for sure,
Okay.
and it's an evidence of race-based
I would
injustice.
agree it is
Um,
it is evidence of injustice, but not racism.
I think it's racism when you have it between African Americans and whites. Um, I don't see how you can at that point say that it's not.
Well, let me give you another way to interpret that evidence, because I know a lot of people point to disparities like that. They want to show, look at the wage gap. Well, a lot of it from what I've because I think maybe a few years I would have agreed until I read books like this by I'm pretty sure you're not a big fan of Thomas Sowell, but discrimination and disparities. But he actually points to a lot of the things that people want to call like racism is like, well, let's talk about 75% of black people growing up with fathers. Well, that surely will affect the income of the home if you only have one parent. You know what I'm saying? And this is not to say that all white people have both parents, because that's not true. But anytime a person doesn't have both parents, they're actually the wages are like staggeringly lower than people who have both their parents in a home. And so for me, I see that. I think the last time I looked at it for blacks, 70% grow up without their father, or their parents are not married. And so I think that's a huge reason why. I didn't grow up without my father. I grew up without my father. I don't know about your you know upgrowth. Yeah, so same thing, man. And so it actually shows the importance of fatherhood in the black communities. Thomas Sowell points to in his Discrimination and Disparities books that when black people are married, they actually have a higher statistic of having financials better than whites, and actually doing better than many whites. And so I think that's just amazing. When the black family, sticks together, they do way better than other people.
So I think too, you have to consider, you have to think of the injustices, right?
Hmm.
There were times where black people couldn't get into certain universities,
Hmm.
couldn't get certain
Hmm.
jobs, only because they were black.
Hmm.
And that is perpetuating poverty, which then perpetuates crime, which then you have black men in prison, which takes them out of the home. Um, I think kind of the narrative that Soul and others try to give of just, well, black men are deadbeats.
Well, that I don't think
I
I
had
don't.
my thoughts in my
Well,
life.
to be fair, I don't think that's what he's saying.
Okay, well, that may not be what he's saying, but I'm saying how everything has a trickling effect. And that's why there are even many, I think just about all of them, critical race theorists who say, yeah, we need affirmative action because there was a time where we couldn't get in certain schools and certain jobs simply because we were black.
Affirmative.
And that,
I'll let you finish your thought. Go ahead.
yeah, and that's a type of reparation, right? What we're correcting the wrong that we've committed, right?
Yeah.
It's this restitution. The Bible's replete with restitution passages, right?
Absolutely.
Um,
I think there is a difference between restitution and reparations. Maybe we can get into that in a second. But I do think there's a affirmative action has historically been terrible for black people. Let me show you why. Because affirmative action, what it does is they place they try to distribute their jobs or get people into university. Let's use universities for one. Like say like a Yale. We need this certain amount of people into Yale. So we'll take these people who are black, even if they're not qualified, to be in this institution. But we need to meet this quota, so to speak. And so you get these people who aren't as qualified, but hey, they're in this university, and you know what happens to a lot of people in those universities? They end up dropping out, and now they're actually in a worse position than before you tried to help them. And so I don't think affirmative action is a good idea in the long term. And in the initial basis, it sounds good. Oh, we're helping black people get educated, get in these universities, but it actually hurts them in the worst because now they get in the university, they drop out, now they got debt. You know what I mean? Which we can go on about debt and how that can affect
yeah,
people and things like that. So I don't think the answer is affirmative action. I think it's just treating people equal. Um, you know, yeah, we can get
yeah,
into that, but yeah, I'm sure you want to respond to
yeah,
that.
yeah. Now that's so.
Like, what would you say to what I just brought up? Like, hey,
Okay, yeah.
look, affirmative
So
action actually hurts a lot of people. You know?
yeah, so I think there's an issue when you said they're kind of gathering in unqualified black people. Um, I don't think that's what they're doing, right? Like, if they were gonna say, okay, we need a certain quota, they wouldn't look at me and say, okay, yeah, you're gonna go to Yale, right? They would look at people that, you know, um, have good SAT scores, so people that maybe are slightly less qualified than white people,
Yeah.
slightly less qualified, but it doesn't mean that they're not qualified. And if they're not given the opportunities,
But
then who's to say that they are not
so
qualified?
so I, I
Um,
don't I don't think being less qualified than Yale means you're an idiot because I'm not qualified for Yale.
no,
But they're actually
yeah,
because I mean it's pretty tough to get, and I wouldn't actually recommend someone go to Yale anyway with all the liberalism going on. But that's a whole nother topic. But just because you can't
yeah,
get into Yale doesn't mean you won't be successful because there are many universities that are push higher learning and education that I think actually would benefit black people if they went to those than rather trying to because I think being less even you say a little bit less qualified I mean, I still think that hurts people because they may come from a poor um, background which doesn't value education, and it's like kind of like what you brought up. It's catch up, and they have to catch up, and it actually puts them behind, and that can be overwhelming just coming into a college, or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. And I think kind of the reverse of that is you have a lot of white people, right, that are underqualified. I mean, you had
Sure.
that too,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah,
That when there was a time where, black people were explicitly left out,
yeah,
and it's like, yeah, you're leaving out geniuses, right? Just because, they're black,
yeah.
or maybe they're a little too dark. Um,
Maybe I could
yeah,
say this because here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that
yeah,
the racism in the past was okay. It was evil.
yeah,
It withholding people who were qualified from jobs, education was not right. But here's what I'm saying. I don't think an overcorrection is, well, let's prefer black people, no matter if it's. I'm all for, hey, we hire the most qualified person. Um, we let the highest qualified people into this in the education system, and so I don't think the overcorrection is the solution as well. So that's I guess that would be my position on that.
yeah. No, but I don't see it. I don't think it's an overcorrection, right?
Hmm.
I forget which president it was, but he gave an illustration of holding the people back in chains for hundreds of years, right?
Hmm.
And the white race, they've been running free, right? And then we can't just unleash the black people and say, well, all things are equal. It's like, well, no, all things aren't equal. We've we've been enslaved for hundreds of years, right? We've been kept out of top universities and jobs, and there's still these discrepancies are still here. Um, so it's really a correcting the scales, right? Correcting the scales of really what's been an injustice.
But
And you said something
yeah, go ahead.
interesting. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say you said something interesting about um equality,
Hmm.
right? And I agree with that, right? Especially when it comes to things like punitive justice, things like that. I agree with equality, but at the same time, we need equity, right? So we need, and the Bible does teach about giving a priority to the disadvantaged, right? The orphan, the widow, the stranger, the poor, right? And I would argue that the stranger in the 20th century America is
Black people,
the African American,
they're interesting.
yeah, who got brought here against their
Very
wills
interesting.
um, to this land, right?
I would
So
argue that
there is,
the Bible actually doesn't tell us to prefer the poor, but to make sure we're looking out for them as well, not to neglect them.
well, that,
Because I would see to prefer them as well would be partiality. Um, we shouldn't prefer either party. I would argue, but we should justice doesn't care if you're poor or rich, black or white, right? We we don't prefer any single party or person or group, right? Justice is, so to speak. I don't. You may not like this language, but colorblind. Like, it doesn't take those things into consideration before justice is handled. You know what I'm saying? And so, I'm not really sure. I would agree with that. Agree with that.
yeah.
And that.
Can
And
I read some?
yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna read some
Hmm.
passages that talks about um, how we should treat the aliens and the widows and the orphans.
And
You should not.
why do you believe
Yeah.
that black people are the like the aliens or the orphans, and white people are the oppressors? And
Well,
this kind of gets into the whole
yeah.
thing of where the barring or this critical race. I don't think this is actually compatible with scripture.
Okay. So why do I think that black people today are strangers in this land?
Yeah,
1619.
oppressed or something like that.
Yeah, 1619. Against our wills, black people were brought here.
Hmm.
Um, So when it talks about stranger, right, it's just talking about a foreigner, right? Someone who this is not their native land. And
That's
honestly, if we're
everybody.
honestly, not Europeans' native land either.
Yeah,
It's the Native American native land.
exactly.
Um, but they weren't oppressed when they came here.
Who wasn't?
The European came here and actually wiped out the Native Americans. Christopher Columbus, horrible, horrible person. Shouldn't celebrate his holiday.
You know there are
Um,
white people enslaved here as well, right?
by
By
whom?
whites. There were black people who had white
By
slaves.
other white.
There were black people who had black slaves as well.
That may be true, and that's a very
Did you know?
small
Did you
number.
know that
Um,
the blacks, you know, the African American slavery? I hate that term, African American. Slavery that Africans were enslaved here isn't the largest slavery actually um, in the world. It was actually Europeans being enslaved by other European slaves and also African slaves. Um, so it's not the so like does this framework only work in America? Is it only in a Western thing? Like or does every oppressed group, so to speak, need to take on this critical race theory ideology?
they can, and the thing that's interesting is again sticking to race-based slavery because it's interesting that you said that race is a social construct,
Hmm.
which critical race theorists agree with that.
Right,
So,
but
I mean, that's a truth that we can cling to hard.
but I'm
Is
saying,
that
but I'm
race is
saying,
a social
I would make
construct?
that distinction not because critical race theory says it, because I believe that's a biblical. There's only one human.
Of course it is.
Yeah, so there's only one human race. So here's the difference. I'm not saying critical
But
race.
does that mean that there's no injustices based on race and there's never been? That's not what that means.
Agreed.
Yes, it's a social construct and it's not.
Ethnicity.
And it's but it's real. And people racial profiling, that still happens today. It still
So
happens.
so here,
Um
allow me to let me lay out this distinction because my argument isn't
yeah.
that critical race theory or some other ideologies don't have true things to it. My argument is that um, critical race theory, this ideology, does not stem from scripture. So when you say so, critical race theories, it's very out there in their language. People from Robin DiAngelo, Ibram Kendi, Derek Bell, many critical race theories have not just suggested, but stated clearly that white people are inherently racist. Black
They
people,
haven't
they haven't said that?
no,
Really?
they haven't said that.
No person.
I I haven't read
Hold on a
where
second.
white people are innately
Well,
racist.
critical race theory's definition of racism involves privilege and power, or hatred and power. It deals with the idea of power, not just hatred.
Because it's been set up that way. It's been constructed
No,
that
yeah,
way.
exactly. And that's a critical race theory definition of racism. I don't hold to that definition. I don't think that's the Bible's definition of racism or hatred or
It's historical fact that it is socially constructed.
I'm
It
so
started in
so my
Portugal and Spain,
hold on.
and that's
My
historically
argument isn't
proven.
that powerful people haven't done racist things. That's not my argument. My argument is that's not a biblical definition of racism. Racism,
What's a biblical?
yeah. Thank you for asking. Racism biblically doesn't care if you have power or power or not. If you hate your brother, if you hate someone who's made in the image of God, that is racist. Or better yet, partial. You are
So you
it has nothing to
so
do
do
with
you
skin
believe
tone.
in
But go ahead.
do you believe in social injustice and social justice? Is that a thing?
You got to define what you mean by that. Should
Um,
justice be done collectively? Is that what you're asking?
yeah, yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
of
like,
course.
do judges take bribes, right, to cheat the poor? Well, the Bible sure says it does. If they do it to the poor, then why can't then out of self interest,
Hmm.
Why do we not think that it's race-based if we see in the Bible throughout it's class-based, it's gender-based, but there's nothing in the history of America that tells us that it's race-based? That doesn't.
I never suggested that. I've actually admitted quite a few times that racism has existed in America. Racist acts have existed. Racism exists today. The issue is, does the Bible define racism in the same way as critical race theory? And therefore, should we use that as an analytical tool? I suggest no, that the Bible nowhere suggests an act is only racism if someone has power. And if you say you agree with that definition, I would love for you to show me biblically how that is true. Because I can actually find,
The Bible, yeah.
there's many examples that show the opposite. But go ahead.
So what do you do with the passages? I think of Proverbs 31.
Uh-huh.
I think it's King Lemuel, and it tells him specifically, you defend the poor. Let me see if I can find it just really quick.
And this is going to be a proof text for proving racism involves power.
It's proving that when you've been given power, you have to intentionally defend the oppressed, the poor, the orphan, the widow. And remember Solomon's prayer, give me wisdom. Why? So that I can execute justice amongst your people.
Okay.
So if we have these disparities that I opened up with that are not being addressed by those in power,
and that's white people,
then are they doing justly? Well, majoritarily, yes. I mean, yeah. I mean, it is.
But is it people who have power, or this collective base of people who are perceived to have power?
They have power. I'd say they have power. Yeah.
White people.
And nowhere.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I'm not gonna interrupt you. Go ahead. You should finish your point.
Okay. No,
Sorry
I was gonna say too. The Bible doesn't really let us off the hook by saying, well, I would give to this poor person, but I wonder why he's poor. I wonder what he's on. And we do all this with we do. That's not what Matthew 25.
Yes,
and Jesus' teaching says. Jesus says, "You lend to me, you lend to the poor, you lend to the Lord."
Is it
right?
Let me show you. Is it just to continually give to a poor person who uses their money on drugs? Should we just help the poor?
I mean, if
no, whoa.
Of course not.
Whoa. Just got to help the poor, though, right? Just got to help the poor. Doesn't matter how they use their money. We just got to give them money, right?
So Proverbs 31.
Hold on. Can you
speaking King Lemuel? Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves.
Right.
For the rights of all who are destitute, speak up and judge fairly. Mm-hmm. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy.
And you think that's black
people? That's pretty straightforward, brother.
And you think that's black people?
I think that's the poor.
Do you think that's black people?
But I think that when he talks about the destitute, the needy, I think some translations actually say the oppressed, that's the poor, that's the orphan, that's the widow, that's the stranger in the land.
Do you think that's black people?
The poor groups. I think that we're strangers in this land. So we've been oppressed in this land. By your own admission, we've been oppressed by this land.
So Proverbs 31 has application. It's about the black man. You know. I
didn't say it was about.
Not only black people. Not only black people.
I said.
You said
what it's about is those in authority, kings, judges, striving for equity. Mm-hmm. Don't take bribes from a rich person so that you can corrupt justice.
Right.
And that's something that was happening. That's something that was happening in the books of Malachi, right? And God actually says, when he sees that, he says, take your festivals, take your Sabbaths. I don't want it. You guys do right. Seek justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God. Cut it out. And when we see, and I mean, the American church's track record with issues like slavery, civil rights, Jim Crow, the Holocaust in Germany is very checkered. And let me tell you, they're going to have to stand before the throne of God, and he's going to say, when I told you to care for the orphan, the widow, the poor, the stranger, the oppressed, I'm a just God. So that's not just Old Testament commandments that we can just throw away. Those are things that we have to continue to be striving
Are you,
for. And if we see, this is where the black comes in, because you keep wanting to push that narrative.
because we're talking about critical race
If
theory, that's why.
if if the statistics that I read you were reversed and it was white people that were facing these discrepancies, and I'd say, listen, we got to speak up for white people. And we got to give white people affirmative action. And we have to give white people reparations. That's not the way that's not the way the cookie crumbled.
I would say
Um,
I would make the
the
same argument.
disparity,
I would be making the same
the
arguments, my friend.
disparity, and then I would say to you that you're not seeking biblical justice.
I would disagree. I think I am. I believe I am because I actually believe the things you brought up are actually harmful, and I gave my reasons for things like affirmative action, reparations, things like that, and I've done that many times. But okay, because like I don't want us to get away from the topic of critical race theory.
Yeah.
Would you say that black people can be racist?
Is that? Well, I guess that's pertinent to our question. Can they be racist in their heart? Sure, they absolutely can. I think of Elijah Muhammad, right? Who supposedly, he witnessed his parents being lynched, and as a young boy,
Mm-hmm.
and that experience, I can't even imagine. Like, that experience filled his heart with such vitriol and hate towards the I'm quoting him, towards the blue-eyed devil, right? The white devil,
Yeah.
right? So, like, yeah,
So
and especially when you're dealing with people who have seen parents lynched, people who have seen wives raped, people who have
no,
have been
I'm asking about
beaten, themselves
I'm asking about
beaten.
today.
Today,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, you can have that same fear
Because
in your heart.
generally when
But as far as having power
there we
to
go. There we
affect,
go.
yeah. As far as having power to, because I do believe in systemic racism.
Yeah, I know.
I think that my numbers prove that, right? The fact that
So give me your biggest proof of systemic racism.
I just gave them.
The,
I just gave them.
and,
But I'll give an
and I gave
example
counter
of
examples of how that doesn't prove that it's because of just racism. Just people don't
your
want.
counter example, which I did counter. Your counter example was, well, look at the black family. Look at black
No,
culture.
actually, no.
The father.
Actually, it was actually greater than that. It was look at what happens when any culture does not have mother and father. The gap is actually to the point I'm proving.
But you know why that doesn't work? You know why
Why
that doesn't
why is
work?
that?
Because the discrepancies, the incarceration discrepancies, aren't just for any culture. That's for black culture, right? The alarming incarceration rates, you don't see that in the white culture. You see it in the black culture. So when we start talking, so either what you're saying is it only applies to black culture, or what you're saying, and this is what I think guys like Soul are saying, is that the reason why the incarceration rate is so high in the black culture is because the fatherlessness is so high in the black culture.
Yeah.
Which I think there's truth to that. But remember what
Yeah, it's like
I said.
70%. It's
But remember what I
it
said.
goes.
No, you did bring up that stuff.
Yeah,
What I said is poverty produces crime,
I would
right?
disagree.
You gonna steal something if you gotta feed your family.
I would disagree, my friend.
Um.
And we
Okay.
can
Well, you can
you can
disagree, but
look at before, after slavery, up until the 1960s.
so remember the prayer of
Hold on.
Amiel. Let's go back to the
Let me
Bible.
bring up this point because it addresses what you just
Yeah,
said.
yeah.
Up until the 1960s, this wasn't the case. The black family was in poverty, yet there wasn't a high crime rate up until like the 1960s in many of like places like Harlem or Atlanta or things like many
when they started recording.
many
Yeah,
many major um, populations of suburban areas and things like that. And so I don't think it follows if you're poor you're gonna be a criminal. Talk about a assumption or or thinking negatively about
the biblical,
a group of people.
the biblical,
You think the
it's the
Bible
biblical.
you
Give, don't give me riches.
hmm
I might forget you.
right.
Don't give me poverty. I might steal.
Yep.
Place me in the middle,
Huh,
right?
right.
So I won't do either of the extremes.
Well,
That's a prayer
yeah,
request,
but
right?
hold on.
And he's like, Lord, if you give me poverty,
The point
I might have to steal some bread so I
Yeah,
can
yeah,
eat.
but the point isn't. I don't think that's a causal relationship. That's saying every poor person will steal because hey, they're
Of course
poor, or
not.
or even a large amount of them. Like I said, I pointed to a historical truths is that up until the 1960s, there wasn't a high crime rate in places like Harlem and things like that. Why is that? Well, because the family structure was up there until things like welfare came along that destroyed the black community or got the father out the home, things like that.
Well, that's not taking into account things like patrolling, things like surveillance, things like, get this, we're going to prevent crime before it happens. How do you
Yes,
prevent crime before it
that's
happens
good.
without profiling? You don't.
So you're
You don't.
so are you
That's the only way
are
you can
are
stop crime before it happens is if you profile.
are you saying that the black community would be better off if police got out of these communities?
They shouldn't be as heavily patrolled as they are.
So
When you
what?
have
Just one
white collar
cop there?
crimes happen today, that you get a slap on the wrist
That's actually not.
versus
That's
blue
actually
collar crime.
that's actually not true. But what's the solution to I guess what you're bringing up? I mean, I
I
would
have.
I would disagree with it because it sounds like well the solution to keeping black people out of jail, I guess off drugs or in the home is to get the cops out of there because they're watching our neighborhood too much to make sure nothing's going on.
Will patrol equally, but why are we being, again, you're preventing crime before it happens. So then you're profiling. And
But
guess where we're going to place our police? Guess where we're going to place our police force to prevent crime from happening?
I it
Not actually crime is taking place, but we're going to try to get a heads up on it.
it would
Guess where we're going to place our police
but
force?
it would sound like you should want the police in these communities because of what you said just a minute ago that these
Not
commu
with police
well, well,
brutality
well hold on
and
well
racial.
hold on a second because you stated that poor communities typically have more crime. Well, why wouldn't you want more police there? Just better officers, right?
Because the way they treat us.
Yeah, but okay, let's say, hey, look, let's get them better trained so they won't because we need them to stop the crime in the communities, right?
Yeah, we need to hold them accountable
Yeah, I,
too.
I agree. But police police brutality actually doesn't just happen to black people. I mean, it just goes more viral.
I mean,
It just goes way more viral. You can have the
well,
same act that
the number is proportionate too.
yeah, sure, just because we have a lower population here, and so but here I want us to get back to the topic.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. I have some more
so
that I
because
wanted to get.
and
Yeah,
I know you don't have too much time because you have other commitments and things like that, which is totally fine. But critical race theory, you know, um, this idea of power and privilege. You would say that is a biblical concept when it comes to like hating someone or racism. Like it's racist if it's done to an oppressed group, but what if that oppressed group turns around and does it to the oppressor? It's not racism.
it's like, how do you mean? Because what could an oppressed person really do to a person in power? Now, sure, they could beat them up, they
Racism
could
has
kill
nothing to
them,
do
right?
with the
But they can't keep.
that has
I
nothing to
can't
do with
keep.
racism.
I can't keep someone from going to university, right?
So what?
We've never had the power to keep white people
But that's not.
out of
But that
universities.
that's not. That's not. Something can be racist and not have that effect, right?
I'm not following you.
Are you saying an act is only racist if it holds someone back?
No, I'm broadening it. You're narrowing it and saying racism is in the heart. Racism is hatred.
Yeah,
That's what racism.
that's what Jesus taught.
You're narrowing it. I'm saying, yeah, it's that,
So
and
black people can do it. So the
in their heart.
yeah, that's what racism is. A sin of the heart.
Well, but that's not all it is. That's a real reductionistic view of racism.
Well,
Again, prejudice.
hold on. Let me form it out. Racism is a sin of the heart, which has manifestations externally. So I'm just like lust does as well. I'm not saying it's only of the heart, but I'm saying there could be no action that happens externally, and it's still evil.
But then too, what I think you're assuming, and I don't think it's necessarily true, because remember we talked about race as a social construct,
Hmm.
right? That race is something that's we've made up,
Hmm.
right? That white people have made up.
Hmm.
We talked about that,
Hmm.
and as you make up this race and this racial hierarchy, you start to spread racial lies, right? Things like, well, black people are fit for slavery because they're like beasts, or black men are sexually immoral, black women are sexually immoral, black men are criminals, black men are thugs. The list goes on and on and on and
And
on.
those,
As you begin to perpetuate
you know,
these lies, even things like the curse of Ham, right, from our theologians, even things like, well, white people are from Adam, but black people are from a subhuman species,
you,
right? That's not quite human,
you know,
right? All of these
there's
lies
been many
being perpetuated.
there's been many black people who've taught the same thing.
There's some that talk the same
No,
thing.
there's been a lot of like cult groups who've taught it as well, and I would say that's evil too. So what I'm arguing
Of
is
course it's
for
evil.
equality. So if you, bringing up racist acts the other way is not going to be.
But you're arguing for equality while turning a blind eye to years and years and years of oppression.
Nope.
Even if you remember when the Hebrews came out of Egypt, how they were given all of these treasures, right, coming out as kind of a God giving them retribution for 430 years of slavery. So I'm all for equality, but first we got to catch up, right? We all the way back
No,
here.
we're
We got to
not.
catch up.
no,
Start talking about
no.
equality.
Black people are not at the back. You can't say that about black people. I actually think this is one of the harmful things about critical race theory is they assume they actually have the same ideology of the KKK. Is they assume that black people are in the back and that white people are superior.
It was bloody. KKK was a
I
bloody,
said
bloody
yeah,
ideology.
yeah, yeah. I'm saying the ideology. Like they have the same framework. Like they think white people are better. Critical race theory assumes that.
We don't think black people are better. We think black people are equal. We're anti-racist. We think black people are equal and we need to be treated equally.
So what
And
if
when black people say things like black power and black beauty and black is beautiful, that is to combat the hundreds of years of lies from pseudoscience, from pseudo-theology, from pseudo-psychology that said black people were inferior, that black people were dumber, that black people were uglier,
here's
your nose is
here's
too big,
here's
your lips are
here's
too
here's one
big,
of
your hair is too nappy.
yeah.
And we said, no, black is beautiful. Songs of Solomon. I am black, I am
That's
beautiful.
not about black people, but I agree with it.
Of course, you probably see it as black as sin, but I've been washed by the blood of the Lamb,
No,
right?
no, neither. But let's actually deal with the point at hand. Um, my look, this is what a lot of critical race theories do, and a lot of woke people do. They always go to racism in the past to prove that racism exists in the racism of today exists, and one of the things it does is it perpetually holds white people as up to
2017.
yeah, it holds white people today as almost the progenitors of slavery, as if they were up there whipping black people with slaves. Well, you can't hold a person. You can't hold a person responsible for the sin they did not commit in this sense.
You can when it comes to
You
reparations.
can.
Yeah.
So if I find a sin your great grandfather,
What's
hold
that?
on, wait. If I find a sin that your great
Yeah,
great
yeah.
grandfather did, and I find out that it affected someone, I can hold you responsible for it.
The Book of Ezra.
Hold on, can you answer that question?
So
Well, can you answer that question?
ask it again.
If I can find a sin that your great great grandfather committed that affected someone today, can I hold you responsible?
So you use the word sin, which is interesting. Yeah, it is sin. So if, let's say, for generations and generations, um, my grandfather, and then like his father, his father, has been taking from your family, right? And in an indirect way, right? Because no one's asking white people to empty their pockets and give it to black people. If in an indirect
Yeah, they
way,
are.
if, if in an indirect way, I'm asked to fix that.
No, in a
Yeah,
very direct way.
plenty of white,
Very
and
direct.
there are plenty of white people that say yes and amen to that,
Yeah, because
right? Just like I said,
there's a lot of white
affirmative
guilt
action
going
is a
on.
type of.
A lot of white guilt going on. But I would say that's unjust biblically because you're not supposed to hold the sins of the father against the children, things like that. That's in Ezekiel. And so
That, but what does that have to do with? What does that have to do
it
with?
has to do with it.
What? How
It
does
has to
that
do with what I'm
open in
talking about.
18 and 20? How does that open?
How does what open?
How does that passage start? I'm gonna find it. I think it's 18 and 20.
Yeah.
The one who sins
Mhm.
is the one who will die.
Mhm. Yep.
We're not talking about killing white people. I'm not. I'm not talking about killing white
That
people. I'm not talking about giving them the death penalty. We're talking about something very specific when we start getting into reparations. So that example is talking about you can't be put to death for the
no
sins of your
no no
father,
no no no
right?
no no. That's not what. That's not only the point of that passage. It's saying you can't that there is no punishment for the person who did not sin.
And you know what Exodus says? I forget the passage. It says, by all means, make reparations. And you want to know
Yeah.
why they made
Well,
reparations in the Old Testament?
restitution.
Restitutions, reparations,
Not
restitutions.
this.
I'll use
It's not the same
restitutions for
thing
you. Now, I'll use restitutions. You know why they did restitutions in the Old
because
Testament?
they sin against the
Because
people.
if you didn't pay restitutions after committing a crime, you were a slave for 6 years.
Let me ask you this: who had to pay restitution?
They had laws in
Who
place.
had to
This
pay
is my point.
restitution?
They had laws in place to make sure restitutions were paid.
I agree.
But guess what? If those restitutions didn't get paid, you're going to either be a slave, or if those laws were not in place, you would have to come back, right? The book of Ezra, right?
I don't want to lose this point.
Where,
Who had to pay
yeah,
restitution?
the person who committed the crime, but there were laws
Thank
in
you.
place
You,
to make sure that
thank you.
happened.
Thank you.
That was my whole point. I said that.
Yeah,
I
but
said
you're actually using
they were forced to.
you're using another framework in
No,
this.
no.
Let me show you how your analogy you're not agreeing with your own point. You said those who committed the act had to pay restitution. Show me one person today and a white person today who
That's
had slaves.
because biblical justice. That's because biblical justice had it set up that way.
Agree.
Because the righteous God had it set up that
Agree.
way.
He's holy.
America is not Israel.
I agree.
America is not a Christian nation.
I agree.
I don't think America ever was a Christian nation.
I agree.
So
But what does that have to do with the
my
point I'm
point
bringing up?
is, what it has to do with my point is, Again, restitutions must be paid. That's
Agreed.
what it says in the
By
scripture.
those who commit
They
the
must
sin.
be paid. And again, there were laws to make that happen. If those laws are not in place, that's the sin of the nation.
Okay, but
Because
I find it interesting that you go back to Exodus to say America owes reparations, and then when I bring up the counter to show us how it's not how it doesn't align with the situation, then you say, well, America's not Israel. So it's like you use the example of Israel to show why black people should be getting reparations, and then when I counter it to show, well, it actually isn't in line with what you're bringing up, you say, well, Israel's not America. So it's like is this double standard almost? It seems. You see what I'm
no, I
saying?
think you missed the point
Okay.
where I said restitutions were in the Old Testament
Right.
because the law was set up that way
Right.
by God.
Right.
And yeah, if you didn't pay those restitutions, you were going to be a slave until you could pay it off with manual labor.
Okay.
We don't have that here.
Okay.
That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have something like that here.
Right.
And what my point is, this is the only point I'm making, is that restitution must be paid. That's what the Bible says.
I agree.
And they had a system where that worked, where the offender in that time could do it. I think of the reparations that the Japanese got in 1988 after the World War II encampment. They got reparations.
Okay.
I forget how much. I forget. Oh man.
Let me ask you this, because I want to get back on the topic of, because we talked about, should critical race theory be used as an analytical tool? So you agree with the argument earlier that you agree with their view of racism, and you don't agree with critical race theory as the whole, though. I just want to make that clear for those listening. Will doesn't agree with critical race theory as a whole, but just their, well, I'm not even going to just say, but just because I don't know what all, but their view of racism, you believe in how they describe history, you agree with, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me give you
Yeah.
let me give you a so if you agree with that, can we use Mormonism as an analytical tool? Because they get things right.
As far as what?
The family.
To analyze what?
The family. Mormons do
people strangely.
Huh? What's that?
Some people strangely do, but
like, hey, they teach teach have a lot of kids, take care of your kids,
so
they're very in the home.
Yeah.
Can we use Mormonism as an analytical tool?
The issue I have with comparing it to Mormonism, Arianism is strictly against Christology. That directly affects our Christology. So how does critical race theory innately attack Christology?
It
doesn't.
Well,
how does it
affects theology.
Hold
on. It affects
theology.
It
attack us worshiping the God of the Bible?
It affects.
It doesn't. Maybe the God of America, but not the God of the Bible, right?
So
it doesn't.
So just because it doesn't affect,
hold
on. Just because it doesn't affect Christology doesn't mean it doesn't affect any Christian theology.
I didn't say that, but I'm saying that's why you can't compare it to.
So you would agree that it does affect Christian theology.
I didn't say that either.
So it can.
In what ways? In what ways?
Come on, just be. In what ways does it? I'm asking you.
In what ways does it not?
In what ways does it?
Anthropology.
No. In what ways does it?
Does it what?
Affect Christian theology.
In what ways does it affect Christian theology?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we talked a little bit about their anthropomorphic views, right? Their anthropology, right? That all men are equal, right? And that there is no such thing as race. It's a social construct. But it's real.
In what ways?
But it's real.
In what ways does it affect it negatively? Like in a way you wouldn't. What do you disagree with critical race theology from a Christian perspective? Ultimately, is what I'm asking.
It depends, because like there's so many different ideas and views, right? Like I'll give you an example. There's some that have this intersectionality with homosexuality, right? I don't agree with that. Um, that's just one of the more obvious ones I could think of off the top of my head.
But you would say they get the.
And then like
Go ahead.
if there's any, which I haven't found it in critical race theory, but if there's any espousing of bodily harm or violence or anything like that, I clearly don't espouse that. Um, yeah, I don't espouse that. So those are the things
So
that I
there.
can think of off the top of my.
So the view of man, you would agree with.
I do agree with their view of man.
So critical.
I think that they see the fallenness of man, the sinfulness of man,
White man.
and I think that they see the equality of man.
You think they want equality?
Yeah, I think they want equality.
Hmm.
I think that if we underestimate what hundreds of years of segregation, Jim Crow, slavery, if we underestimate the damage of that, if we underestimate that this nation was built on that,
Every nation was.
and I've told you this before, right? I don't believe that it's just going to self-correct itself. The Bible doesn't give us that option of justice where you just wait it out and justice is going to happen. No, seek justice. Love mercy. Walk humbly with your God. No, you speak for those that can't speak for themselves. No, you fight for the poor and the orphan and the widow. You be active in this,
But
especially if you're a king, especially if you're a judge. Don't take bribes. Treat everyone
this
fairly.
is the "who is my neighbor" kind of dialect, because in critical race theory they view poor, oppressed, widowed, orphan as black people, but that's not the Bible's definition of those things. It's you don't ask someone what is your nationality before I
So
find
who's the
out.
stranger? Who's the stranger? Or does that not apply today?
The,
Who's the foreigner or the stranger, depending on your translation?
well,
The alien,
well, we're
depending on your
all
translation.
strangers and foreigners in America because it wasn't founded by any of us. So, but the point is, when it comes to things like oppressed and poor, you can't say that's about black people. You can't say that's about just. It, you can't redefine poor to mean that. It's about
It's about the poor.
any ethnic group who's poor. You don't help someone. You don't about to help someone and say, "Well, what's your father? What's your nationality?" Like that's like the Hebrew Israelite kind of ideology. You help them. You know, it's not about ethnicity.
It's about helping those that are in need. If you
Yes,
see these
black or white.
if you see these discrepancies that are race based,
You're asserting that.
and you're not doing anything to fix those
You're assuming they're race
discrepancies,
based. I'm not saying they don't
they
need to.
are race,
I'm not
brethren.
saying they don't need to
And all
be.
I mean by
Let me say this.
maybe I
Let me
should
say
give it.
this real quick, and I'll let you say that
Yeah,
statement.
yeah.
I'm not saying they don't need to be fixed. They do. I asserted that in the beginning, but I'm saying you're assuming a racial narrative behind these things, which it doesn't necessitate that being the case.
I think it does, and I think even in your example with the 70% in the black home, well, that's not a racial argument.
No,
One argument is saying it actually is.
it's a the
It
father's
actually
not present. Remember what I said also. This applies to any group who doesn't have the father, not just black people. When any group does not have the father present, they are substantially higher risk to be in jail, to be on drugs, lack of education, financial disparities, as you know, the things you said. They are at I mean, it's so high the risk when a person grows up without a father. I don't care if that person's Mexican, Asian, white, black. They are at higher risk for a lot of these things.
why are black fathers not in the home at such a high
You
rate?
can't say it's just because of prison.
I think that's a complex question. I think it's a complex question. And if we just say it's black culture,
I didn't say that.
and that's not a racist
I didn't say
argument.
that. There's many
No, I didn't say
yeah,
you
yeah.
said that. I didn't say you said
There's many
that, but I
reasons.
know people.
There's many reasons, and so yeah, fathers are locked up. That's one reason, but not all are locked up unjustly. Some people sell crack. Guess what? You go to jail for selling crack. Some people don't want to be fathers. That was my father. He got my mom pregnant and just left, bounced. So that's a lot of the attitude, um, you know, and so forth and so forth. There are people locked up unjustly. Yeah, I'll say that as well. So I'm not saying the argument that why the black father is around is one single issue. It is a compound of
Yeah, it is.
multiple issues. But we can't just say, well, that's just because the white man one is locked up. I mean, that's just a lazy answer, I believe, because there's numerous people I know had kids and had nothing to do with them. And
I mean, that's true. I mean, that's true, and
it's a
that
high
is
number.
amongst every
Yeah.
race,
Oh. Oh yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
amongst every
Yeah.
race.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, yeah, it's complex.
It's.
So again, and I'm not saying you, but yeah, for people to just point like, well, black culture, rap music, blah blah
I mean, I
blah,
do think that's a
um,
contributing
it's
factor.
really insulting.
I
It's
mean,
really
you
insulting.
got to
And
admit that.
even in rap music, you do have dissenters that are like, no, we got to do better.
But there.
Like we can't keep about drugs and the whole
But
nine. So there
yeah.
are like
Yeah.
righteous brothers
But let's be
that is
honest.
like
They not getting played much
cut
on
it out.
the radio, right? They don't play a lot of conscious rap on radio. You,
Yeah, there's probably some truth to
you
that.
know what I mean?
There's probably some truth.
And so yeah, I agree with you there that there are a complexity of issues, but like I don't think it's one, and that's never been my argument, and so um yeah, so I mean yeah, we got to do better, man. Black fathers, I truly believe when black fathers in the home, black people do tremendously better. I mean, I look at the people who grew up with their father and the black people who grew up without their father, it's like a world of difference. And thankfully, I'm not in that statistic. But by God's grace, I'm not one of those that are in jail selling drugs. Thankfully, I had people around me who kept me grounded by God's grace. But not everybody has that. Um, you know.
Yeah, and I think there's something too to really consider. Um, when black people first gained the right to vote, right, and they understood that okay, we can't be purposefully right, explicitly using race. So we're gonna come up with grandfather clauses, right? Could your grandfather vote? We're gonna come up with literacy tests, poll taxes. Give us a little change if you want to vote, right? All of these were used in a very secretive way, without mentioning the word black, to keep black people from voting, right? So this is in our past, this is in our history. Things like redlining, right? Very, very secretive ways to keep black people from owning homes in certain neighborhoods, right? So, like, if we think that sinful man cannot find clever ways to discriminate against people based on class, based on age, based on race, based on gender, based on religion, what have you, then maybe we're naive as far as like the sinfulness of man and how creative our wickedness can get.
So
The scriptures talk about that plot evil, right? Um, so I'm not saying that that's like definitive proof, but I am saying like let's be real about this,
yeah.
right?
So
And let's not,
So I'm
yeah,
I'm a, I'm a Calvinist, and so I mean I think you kind of said you had like Calvinist leanings, but I affirm the
yeah,
total, yeah, I affirm total depravity, but I also have a view of the common grace of man, and so
sure,
I'm thankful that man isn't as wicked as I don't believe in utter depravity, so I believe
either.
I believe if one is going to be accused of a sin, then that person needs to have evidence like okay, so for example, right, I believe that adultery is permeating this culture, right? So let's use the same kind of argument you just did for like racism. Well, if we don't think adultery exists and every man is up there looking at pornography, then we've been fooled about the total depravity that would be absurd, and I think a lot of people would see that not every man is looking at pornography, not every man is doing this. Does it happen at a high rate? Oh, sure. Does it happen a lot? Yeah, but I can't just assume that based on you know I guess an overarching view of the sinfulness of man, and so that I kind of would
Yeah.
see kind of that parallel there, you know. But I don't know if you want to respond to that, but I know you have to go. I know you got to study. You
Yeah.
got to get to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll let you say something.
So one last thought.
Yeah,
And I just want to end it here on why I think the church needs to talk about race. And it doesn't have to be critical race theory. It it doesn't have to be woke or whatever pejorative term we want to use for it. But we got to talk about race. I think of,
sure.
Remember the Titans, and that scene always sticks out to me where they're celebrating a big win, right?
Yeah,
And it's Sunshine and Petey and Blue. And Sunshine sees the restaurant. He's like, "Hey, come on, man, let's go in. Let's party. Let's have this fun time." And Petey looks at Sunshine and says, "Oh man, this Virginia, they don't want." And then Blue just says it. They don't want us in here.
yeah,
They go in, and then sure enough, right, the owner of the restaurant, "We don't have any room for you guys. We're full."
all right.
Sunshine looks at him, "Man, what are you talking about? There's plenty of seats here." Then the owner says, "Well, listen, I have a right to not serve whoever I want. You can take these boys out in the back, get them some food in the kitchen,"
Right.
like as if he's like bringing in dogs with him, right?
Right.
So then after that, after they exit the restaurant, Petey shoves Sunshine, right? Ronnie Bass.
Yeah.
He shoves him. And he says, "Man, what was that? I told you." And Ronnie's like, "Whoa, I didn't know." And this is the part that really sticks out to me where P's like, "What do you mean you didn't know? I told you. Do you think I was playing with you? I told you." And then Blue kind of, comes to the defense of his teammate, Ronnie, right? And says, "Come on, man, he didn't know." And like P's heated, right? He's like, "No, I told him." Long story short, black players go their way, white players go their way. And that's a part of critical race theory that says, take the testimony of black people seriously. When they tell you that they've experienced racism, when they tell you this is Virginia, this ain't California, they racist here. And Sunshine's biggest defense was, "Oh, that's in the past. They don't see race anymore. They see football now. We winning. That's in the past. Don't worry about it." And Petey's like, "No, bro." And really, if you look at that scene, Petey got straight up gaslighted by Sunshine. You don't know what you're talking about. For some reason, Sunshine thinks, as an outsider, someone who hasn't experienced oppression, right? For some reason, he thinks that he can speak into the everyday experiences of black people during that time, especially in Virginia. And I think that still happens today, is that there's this lack of believing black people in their testimonies.
Certain black
Real
people.
quick, James, certain white people.
No.
But many of the
certain black people.
Sure.
Because
Sure.
the black experience isn't
I'll say that.
the black experience isn't monolithic. So when you
It's not monolithic at
so
all.
when you say white people don't want to believe black people's experience, we have to ask which black people are we talking about here?
Well, this is what happens. Because let's face it, a majority of black people have experienced racism in America. A majority.
Yeah.
So what happens?
But that's not
You have
that's
20
not
black
that's not the issue.
But no. It is the issue. What you have is you have 20 black people. And let's say out of the 20, 2 of them say, "No, we've never experienced racism." And you have 18 say, "Man, we experienced racism. My daddy experienced racism. His daddy experienced racism." Right?
Might makes right.
Many people, what would they do? Many of the white evangelicals that are so anti talking about race in general, if it's not racial reconciliation, it's critical race theory, it's wokeness, it doesn't matter what the terminology is. What do? They side with the two black people that, for whatever reason, have never experienced racism. That's exactly what happens, bro. And
I,
James Cone,
I,
just real quick.
oh
I
man,
want to read
good
this
old Cone. Let's get it.
real
Let's get
quick.
it.
So he says, it is white intellectual arrogance which assumes that it has a monopoly on intelligence and moral judgment. How else can how else can one explain the shocked indignation when the Kenner report declared that race prejudice has shaped our history decisively? After all, Baldwin, Wright, Du Bois, and a host of other black writers have been saying this for decades, that racism is woven into the whole pattern of American society. Eventually, the judgments of black people are not to be taken seriously, if indeed Whitey reads them at all. The real menace in white intellectual arrogance is the dangerous presumption that the structure that enslaves is the structure that will also decide when and how this slavery is to be abolished. The sociological and psychological reports made by most white scholars assume that they know more about my frustrations, my despair, my hatred for white society than I do. They want to supply the prescription to my problems, refusing to recognize that for over 300 years, blacks have listened to them and their reports, and we are still degraded. The time has come for white Americans to be silent and to listen to black people. Why must the white man assume that he has the intellectual ability or the moral sensitivity to know what blacks feel, or to ease the pain, to soothe the hurt, to eradicate the resentment? Since he knows that he raped our women, dehumanized our men, and made it inevitable that black children should hate their blackness, he ought to understand why blacks must cease listening to him in order to be free. And this last sentence. Since whites do not know the extent of black suffering,
Mm,
they can only speak from their own perspective, which they call reason.
mm,
And that's what happens with this whole debate.
mm.
It becomes philosophized, it becomes abstract, and we forget that, listen, there's a real family somewhere where daddy got killed on the street, right? Because of police brutality, right? There's real daughters, family members of George Floyd, family members of Breonna Taylor. We forget that these are real people, real discrepancies, real black men that can't get jobs to feed their families and resort to crime to feed their families. It does happen. And then end up in jail. And there's a perpetuation of poverty. There's a perpetuation of incarceration. Um, so I'm sure that there's probably a lot in there that you don't agree with. I don't agree, or I agree with. I agree with most of what's in here. Even when he talks about hatred of white society. Oh, so you've read?
Okay,
Okay,
okay.
so that's good. I haven't read that one yet.
Yeah.
But yeah, his point. I think his point is coded though. It's like, trust the testimony of black people.
Hmm.
Trust our solutions for
Quick
ourselves.
question, and I definitely think we should
Shoot,
end
go
this.
for it.
But you think definitely white people should listen to the black experience of the experiences of black people, right? Like it was very clear, right, that
The
white
majority of black people,
the majority.
not all.
Okay, should the black people therefore listen to the majority of white people when they say they're not racist in the church?
When they say they're not racist in the church,
Yeah,
I
should
mean, I'm not saying that we go around calling everybody racist. And I don't think anybody is saying that, or if they're saying it, they're saying it in a way that's
yeah,
not
they
contributing to.
saying it. They're saying
Maybe
it.
I'm just not.
It
Maybe I'm just not
it
picking
wa-
up what they're throwing
it was
down.
Eric Mason
But
who it was Eric Mason who says that white people in the church are infected with the disease of, I think he said, whiteness or white privilege, something of that extent.
yeah.
You know.
Well, I mean,
So yeah, people are saying it.
I haven't read the quote, but what I'm going to say is the American experience, the church experience, is European, right? That's why, like, I love
It's fine.
churches with the regulative principle, like I don't mind it, but that's why like you get in certain churches and it's like, well, why can't we play drums? Why can't we play tambourine? Like what's the cause of that?
But
Why do we play any? Right? So there is something to be said about, and what he's saying is the church is they're within this umbrella of European white culture. It is, right? When we sing the hymns and we don't clap, we don't stomp our feet, right? You know what I mean, right? Like, I don't know if you much experience with the historic black church, but there's a way where different cultures, we even see it in Latino culture, right? There's a way that different cultures express themselves.
But that's okay. It's okay.
Musical.
It's okay if
No,
that's
it's okay. It is okay.
It's not
as long as I
racist.
can express myself.
But it's not
But
racist.
well,
You just have a preference of how you worship, and as long as it doesn't contradict the Bible, that's fine. I'm okay with people
no,
shouting,
yeah,
clapping,
agree.
and I'm okay with the white people's in the as long as their heart's into it.
No, yeah, I've been in both. So
So
like I have long time experience in both.
hey, but
My point is my
there are
point.
Pentecostal white churches who get down just like black people.
They get down. They do. They do get down. My point is that in many of the really conservative, hymn singing churches, at least that I've been in, right, that more expressive and emotional form of worship is frowned down upon. And I only know that because, bro, like I was there, like, bro, I was where you were at like 2 years ago, right? I was Daryl Harris, right?
Hey, praise God.
I was on them cat. And then when I was with Vody, right? But I also always liked the Beatty. And when I seen they had this tension, I said, okay, let me kind of be a little bit more open and let me just kind of explore this
So
a little bit more.
is Vody the sellout? Because that's the common frame of black guys who think like me. We sold out ourselves.
Listen, yeah. I'm not gonna attack anybody's motives or character. I'm gonna say this. I'm gonna say that Vody, his like conferences, right? He's getting money in white evangelical spaces. Lecrae was there, right? And he's kind of excommunicated now.
Sounds like you are assuming his motives.
So take that for what you want to take it at, right? I can't speak with motives.
But he's getting paid by white people.
There's incentive there, is all I'm saying. I mean, I think of Gerald Harris, right? He's going to
there's incentives on the other side.
I mean, that may be true, especially like with with secular ideologies. I can't say there's not incentives, but again, I'm gonna give them that same grace.
Same grace.
I'm not reading anybody's heart. I'm not reading nobody's mind.
Right.
I'm not talking about people's motives.
Right.
I would love to have a coffee someday with Vody and talk it up with him.
Yeah.
I would love to be able to do that with him. So yeah, I'm not going to say that.
Vody got a new book coming out in April. I hope you get it. So
what's it called?
It's called Fault Lines, and it's about this subject. So you might enjoy it.
Yeah, no, I know. He talks about it quite a bit.
Yeah,
he talks about it quite a bit. Yeah, I don't like that. So, kind of maybe an ending question to you, because for me, and I kind of laid it out with my example of Remember the Titans, and other examples, right, of just where like black people are not believed.
Certain black people.
We have to talk about race.
Yeah.
Right, and we can pretend like since 1988, the birth of critical race theory, that we've been more divided since we've been talking about it.
I would go back further than that. Yeah.
Well, yes and no. Like I see what you're getting at. Like,
that's fine. It's fine. Just a minute point.
Yeah. But I think we need to talk about it, and I think we need to be uncomfortable about it. And I think that there are taboo subjects that the church don't want to touch with a 20-foot pole. I think racism is one of them. I think that sexual abuse is one of them. I think that abuse in marriage is one of them. I think pornography, what you brought up earlier, I think is one of them, right? And with critical race theory, just like I said, it was the same thing when it was woke. It was the same thing when it was racial reconciliation. It was the same thing when it was social justice. It's the same thing when it's critical race theory. It's not about, because like there's a bunch of overlap between these ideas. I'm like, it's not so much about critical race theory and where critical race theory came from. It's about stop talking about race. You're making us uncomfortable. We know about the history. We don't care no more. We don't want to hear you. Just shut up about it. I don't know if you heard that letter from a guy who was in the SBC, but he wasn't anymore, and the SBC actually spoke out against him.
Yeah.
But he wrote just like the worst letter about like why he doesn't want to hear about race anymore and why like black people aren't as smart as white people. Like it was pretty awful. I can send you a link to it if you ever want
I saw it
to listen
and
to it.
I saw most people. I saw like everybody who responded to it say this was disgusting, which kind of goes against the idea
Yeah,
of critical race theory, which says that all white people are racist. Like, why are all these white people saying
not
it's disgusting?
yes, brother. Y'all gotta get me that's y'all gotta get me a quote
All
where
right.
they talking about all white people.
How about this?
Yeah, you got
I'll send it to you. Uh,
and if it's a matter of interpretation, then it's a
no,
matter of
no, no.
interpretation.
Okay, I'll send it to you.
If it's clear, like if it's clear,
Okay.
and those people that say that, especially if they're proclaiming the name of Christ, right? Like, because I'm not here to attack anybody. All I'm looking at is data. All I'm looking at is empirically, like what's going on,
Yeah.
and all I'm looking at is the discrepancies, right? That are growing, and I'm
Growing.
like, yeah, something. And I don't think it's black.
You,
I don't think it's black culture.
you think
Yeah,
you think
brother.
you think that
Yeah,
black
let
people
me
are
get my
doing?
quote for you.
I do want to end it soon because, like I said, I gotta go to
Yeah,
sleep soon, and I know you got study soon. But
yeah,
you
yeah.
think black people are getting treated worse in America since slavery?
Since slavery, okay, we want to do it all the way back to slavery, huh? We can do that. Black people still being lynched.
Really?
Yeah, those police killings or
Those are
lynchings.
lynchings.
Ahmaud
Hold on,
Arbery,
hold on. Yeah, you can't call those lynchings, man.
run down and
Come
shot
on,
down.
man.
What
Well,
do you call
hey,
them? What do you
all
call them?
right. Then
What do you call
white people getting
murders?
lynched.
Do we call them
You gonna
murders?
talk about Tony Timpa?
I don't know who Tony Temper is.
I know you don't, cause he's white. He was killed by the Dallas police. Same thing that
Oh,
happened to George
well,
Floyd.
that's wrong.
It don't go viral.
Justice, justice for Tony Temper.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, man.
I mean, if I don't know about it, I don't know about it. But you can't say I don't care about it because I don't know about it. Right?
I didn't try to insinuate that. I didn't try to.
I already said that if the discrepancies were reversed, right, then I'd be talking about reparations for white people. But that's not the historical reality,
All right.
right?
Well,
I mean,
I
so
appreciate your time, Will. We had a lengthy, good, cordial discussion. You know, nobody called anybody names, and hey, if you're right, if we had that, I feel like it was successful just because that happened, and so the fact that
yeah,
I'm not seeing a lot of this happening, which kind of breaks my heart about that. But if
yeah,
more people can
I
do
agree.
this, more people can do this. I think it'll be beneficial. And I hope that those listening in, will do those in their circles, not just not talk to people,
Yeah,
but talk to people. Like we need to be having this discussion. I actually agree that we need to be having this discussion about race. I'm not one to keep quiet on it. As you see my post, I want to talk about it. I talk about it. I don't try to say, well, hey, just shut up. We just gonna not talk about it. That's not my perspective. And so if that is happening, I would agree with you that there needs to be conversation
yeah.
going on.
So can I just take one more
Go ahead. Go
closing
ahead.
remark?
Go
All
ahead.
right. So thank you,
Yeah.
Kdub, for having me on. And I just encourage anyone who maybe you're hearing secondarily from one group or the other. I'd encourage you, don't be afraid to read critical race theorists.
Mm-hmm.
As you told me, K-Dub, Vody has a new book coming out, right? Don't be afraid to read the differing viewpoints and really grasping what each side is saying, because as Christians, it's so important
Right.
that we're not slandering. It's so important that we're understanding what each other is saying. And I think that's what's so important about even this conversation. There's still a lot we disagree
Oh
on.
yeah.
There's some things that we do agree on. But now we have a better understanding than just over Facebook or Twitter or whatever the case may be.
Right.
So I encourage anyone, right? I was where you were at, right? I went from being staunchly against this stuff to being more open to it to now saying, hey, we got to be talking about race. And the data is there. If you want to find it, Google it, look it up. It's there.
Yes,
That's all
there.
I got
Read
to
it.
say.
Read it. Yeah, man. Thank you, man, once again for coming on. Thank you all for watching. Hey, until the next time, grace and peace.